since the richer income groups are tending to save more, and that gives you more investment. Now, of course, we have a slightly more sophisticated view of investment nowadays, but it doesn't come from savings, it's the other way around, but nonetheless. But of course, there's the other, if you like, more microeconomic aspect to this, the view that inequality is good for growth because it provides an incentive for private investment and innovation. This is a very common belief among policymakers across the world. It was extremely common in China in the 1990s and 2000s, for example, but across a large part, much of developing Asia, there was this perception that it's okay. I mean, it's not ideal, but it's okay because it genuinely provides an incentive. And of course, the other second part of it, which I want to consider, is the idea that economic growth necessarily generates more employment. And not just more employment, but in the Kuznets sense, to be super high because you're also wanting structural change, which means industrialization, urbanization, or more employment. Okay? What I want to say, I mean, this is the punchline if you like, is that in fact neither of these holds, neither link is evident in the past half century. So let's look first at the Kuznets curve, because it became axiomatic. By the way, the battery is running low on this computer, so maybe it needs to be plugged in somewhere before it collapses while I speak. Can you add a power link to this? Okay. Yeah. It won't. Yeah. So, this development economists across the world tended to believe in this idea. But actually, when you look at it, even for rich countries, this trend was only evident till the mid-20th century. In fact, a lot of work done by Anup Mishra and others actually showed that inequality is inequality. Just the world gets 8% of global income and 2% of wealth. The top 10%, by contrast, are getting more than half of income, 53%, and own 75% of the wealth. Okay? But what's really also remarkable is the concentration at the very top. So if you look at the right-hand side, you will see that the top 1% of the world get 20% of global income. Okay? And the top 1% of the world also own more than 1/3 of all global assets. All known global assets. This is an underestimate because we don't know a lot of the assets of the super rich. They know how to conceal it. In terms of national inequality, according to the World Bank's numbers, which Gini coefficients of more than 40% are considered highly unequal, well, most of the world is in highly unequal countries, okay? So 83% of countries with 90% of the world's population are actually high income inequality. And furthermore, this has increased in most countries. There are very few countries where it's come down. But wealth inequality has increased even faster. And this is just, if you like, a map by that. You can see we are in the... this is not what the government of India's data would suggest. At the G20 meeting where I happened to be present, our leaders told all of the other leaders gathered that we are the 4th least unequal country in the world, where, of course, we have also brought poverty down to below 5% and so on. So this is a different database which the World Inequality Lab has produced using also the wealth and income tax data and so on, where you can see that we are among the higher inequality countries in the world. And wealth inequality is significantly worse, as I mentioned, than income inequality. Okay, so according to this particular measure, the top 10% owns 3/4 of all wealth, the bottom half 2%, I think I showed you that already. But what's more interesting is that if you take the top 1% of the world, their wealth increased since the turn of the century, their wealth increased by 41%. They captured 41% of all of the new wealth. Whereas the bottom half of the world got an additional 1% of the increase in wealth. So the pace of increase of wealth inequality has dramatically accelerated. If you look at the billionaires in the world, there are about 3,000 of them, 3,065. They now hold the equivalent of 16% of global GDP. And just to get it across further, since it's all intersecting, they mostly are white, male, and come from the poor rich countries, even if their tax residence happens to be some other place nowadays. This is the famous so-called elephant curve of Branko Milanovic, which looks at the change in income growth on the left-hand side and the wealth change on the right-hand side. Now, I'm not a big fan of the elephant curve because it tells you the relative, the proportionate increase, which will appear a lot higher for the lower income groups because they're beginning with a lower base. Right? If you have $100 of income and it increases by 10%, it looks like a 10% increase. $10, it looks like a 10% increase. Whereas a 10% increase for a middle income group, which is the bottom, the lower end, would actually be, let's say, $2,000. So if we did absolute increases, I would actually get a hockey stick. I wouldn't get this elephant at all. But what I really want you to look at is the extreme wealth at the end over there, which is at the last few bits of the right-hand graph are going from the top 90% to the top 99%, 99.9, it goes up to the 99.9999, which is, in other words, the top 0.0001%, 3 zeros, okay, after the dot. That group has absolutely exploded in terms of wealth. So yes, they certainly increase their incomes, but it's the wealth explosion which is of significance. So when we're talking about inequality, we tend to think often because of the impact on poverty. And that is a lot of the concern of many people in ISLE. We link the problem of inequality with poverty, and of course that is critical and important. But the wealth at the top and the concentration of wealth and power at the top is in some ways almost of greater concern today. And as you can see, about 56,000 adults have 3 times more wealth than half of the entire global population combined. Okay, so just 56,000 people. There's a new study by UBS which just came out 2 days ago, which I haven't put in here, but they are suggesting they have a sample of 58 countries covering all the OECD countries, BRICS countries, and so on. And they suggest that 15 individuals own more than 15% of all of that wealth, which is interesting, right? Effectively, we have the greatest concentration of wealth and therefore power that I believe we have experienced in human history. Okay, the other way of looking at it is the functional distribution of income, which is, capital and labor shares. So this is the global shares, and this is at market exchange rates. The other stuff, unfortunately, was at PPP, which understates the inequality. But these are the market exchange rates. And what's really remarkable is the turnaround from about 2000 onwards. Yeah? Before that, the shares are a little volatile, but they stay broadly. Okay. Hello? We need some assistance here because I don't think it got connected. It's back. Hello. Okay. Not back for me. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Where is? Yes, capital and labor. So as you can see, from about 2000, you find a dramatic decline in the labor share and a significant increase in the capital share. I mean, obvious, right? Because the two are inverses. But it's really quite marked. And this is after several decades of relative stability that you find this quite sharp share. And you find this in almost, well, you find it in all regions of the world, but you find it also in almost all countries of the world, which is striking because it's not, this is actually the first time in which you have these similar trends of inequality moving across the world in different ways. But what's also interesting is that within capital, I showed you how the share of capital has gone up, but within capital, incomes are much more unequally distributed. So since 2000, what have we found? We found that within the share of profits, large companies are getting more than small companies. Within large companies, multinational companies are getting more than domestic companies. The share of multinationals in profits is nothing. Within the top 4,000 global multinational companies, the share of the US multinationals has been rising. And this is even though their share of revenues has been lower. Just have a look at this table. To me, it's quite extraordinary that in the period, the average of the years 2005 to 9, about half of the profits went to the US multinationals. By 2015 to 19, just pre-pandemic, more than 3/4 of the profits went to US multinationals. Europe, it's a declining share, but the rest of the world has a complete collapse, right? From about 17% to around 2% of the global profits, of the top 4,000 global companies. Now, please note this includes all of those Chinese companies that are the ones supposedly the most productive, most innovative, and taking over the world in various sectors, including EVs, renewable energy, and such like. They're all in that 2% of the global profits. What that suggests, okay, the other aspect of inequality, which doesn't get talked about enough, but is very significant, is the difference between public and private wealth. And as you can see here, public wealth has barely increased in terms of, since 1980, but private wealth has expanded dramatically. And this is not an accident, this is a policy choice. This is really because, well, partly many governments, including rich OECD governments, are net debtors. Okay, these are financial assets essentially, but also because of a combination of privatization and rescuing private companies when they are facing crises. Okay, so this process of dramatic increase in private wealth is really because of the effective transfer of assets from public to private hands. And that has many implications, okay? It's happened through bailouts, it's happened through privatization, but it's also happened through changes in laws and regulations, what is called redistribution in that sense. And that has many implications in terms of the public fisc and the ability to provide resources to enable social services for people and so on. Okay, now even this is not working. Hello? Okay, I have to hold it here from now. Okay, now the other interesting point to note, however, is that this period of dramatically higher inequality has not given us higher growth. The orange line is the GDP growth annual, okay? And this is in just regular money terms. I mean, it's not constant prices or anything. And as you can see, it's a general trend of decline. But perhaps even more significantly, okay, yeah, these higher, oops. Yeah, these higher profits have not translated into higher investment rates. So here on the left-hand side, we have the investment rates of high-income countries, this is the blue line, and the low and middle-income countries in the orange line. As you can see, they've diverged quite dramatically. Global investment rates, to the extent that they have remained high at all, is entirely because of low and middle-income countries. But let's face it, it's entirely because of China, okay, which accounts for the dominant part of that increase. And it's worth comparing the investment rates in the US and China over the same period that I described, because remember the share of US multinationals and US companies in corporate profits rising dramatically to 3/4, okay? And Chinese companies part of the rest of the world, which is only 2% of global profits, and yet look at the investment rates in US and China. So what is very clear is that the inequality that was supposed to generate more investment doesn't seem to work, at least in this case. Yeah, higher profits are not generating higher investment, in the US case at least. Okay, so we all know that inequality can in fact reduce economic growth, even though the literature often tends to tell us otherwise, and there are several reasons. I mean, the most obvious is the lowering of aggregate demand, because that actually means that, those at the top tend to consume smaller shares of their income, first of all, but with insufficient aggregate demand, you get less mass consumption, underutilization of resources, and therefore less ability to benefit from economies of scale that are both static and dynamic. And that means you're reducing the investment over time, okay? And other than export markets, therefore, there is very limited ability to take advantage of economies of scale. I already talked about how reduced public wealth reduces states' fiscal capacity for public service provision and the ability to undertake counter-cyclical measures unless you're the US and others who can just produce money out of the hat when they want. And of course, it obviously constrains poverty reduction, which is so well known to this audience, I don't need to talk about that anymore. But it has been argued that that in turn increases vulnerability to shocks, forces different survival strategies, which over time can also reduce labor productivity. But there is, of course, what is called a forward momentum of inequality, which is that inequality of outcomes both reflects but reinforces inequality intergenerationally, and because of lack of opportunity in many, many different ways, not just through incomes, but types of education, types of healthcare, and so on. And of course, we also know that it has reduced our ability to fight climate change. Let me show you the next graph, because that captures it better than I could. This is again from researchers at the World Inequality Lab. The bottom 50% of the world is likely to face about 3/4 of the losses, just the purely economic losses coming from climate change. And of course, they have only 2% of the wealth, which means they have no capacity to confront it. The top 10%, by contrast, are responsible for about 3/4 of the emissions, the current consumption-based emissions, and they also will face only 3% of the losses. And, no, sorry, they're responsible for half of the consumption emissions, I'm sorry, 47%. But they have 3/4 of the wealth, so they're the ones with the money to do something about it, which is why everybody keeps talking about the need to incentivize the private sector, create the partnerships and the blended finance that will actually generate it. But as we all know, that doesn't seem to work so well. In terms of investment choices, this is a very recent study that was done, that's quite interesting. The top 1% are disproportionately investing in fossil fuels. And this is before President Trump came to office. Okay? Before that, they were already the ones dominantly investing in fossil fuels, and they're responsible alone for 40% of global emissions through the investment choices. But of course, as I mentioned, extreme wealth brings extreme power. It brings the ability to actually regulate law, to affect laws, regulations, institutions, media, public policies, all of these things. And it is historically unprecedented. And we've seen how it can, because it's inherited wealth can disincentivize effort and innovation. So increasingly, the focus of economic activity at the top of the distribution is on lobbying, influence, regulatory arbitrage, and other rent-seeking behavior. In fact, we used to talk about economies of scale and economies of scope. I am arguing that today's global capitalism is characterized by economies of arbitrage, by the ability, in fact, to utilize this power to affect institutions. And I already told you about this. So why actually has it increased so much? And some of this I already told you, the forward momentum, the intergenerational transmission, the ability of the wealthy to buy the influence, but also, and I think this is very important, the focus of so much government policy on aggregate growth, or at best per capita growth. This is the magic number we're always looking at, is it 6.3, is it 5.2, are we higher than China, all of this kind of stuff. We are still obsessed with aggregate GDP growth.